Hi, this is Jurgen Rasmussen. Welcome to the Provocative Hypnosis vlog. In this episode, I'm going to do an in-depth look at the work of Byron Katie, her claims, her teachings, the experiences that I have had with it since 2003, and also the experiences that my clients have had with this particular approach. I'm going to look at what I think are the strengths and the weaknesses of that particular approach, and also the strengths within the weaknesses and the weaknesses within the strengths. It might get somewhat paradoxical. This review will probably even argue with itself at times. So back in 2003, I had already been seeing clients for 5 years, and I came across a book called Loving What Is by Byron Katie. And it just blew my mind. It just completely rocked my world and helped me gain a deep insight into the nature of thought and the nature of suffering. And since then, I've implemented what Byron Katie calls the work with myself over time and with clients, although I have to say I don't ever really use it in its formalized form. I use aspects of it. I use my own adaptations of it. So let's take a little look. Now, Byron Katie in 1986 was a 43-year-old woman who had spent the last 10 years raging, overeating, chain smoking, being extremely paranoid, and being depressed and having a lot of suicidal thoughts. It got so bad that she didn't brush her teeth for weeks at a time and didn't even leave her own bedroom for weeks at a time. And then one day she checked into a halfway house, and after a week or so at the halfway house, she awoke by a cockroach running across her foot. And she had an amazing, you could call it awakening or profound realization or perceptual shift. Now, I'll read a couple of quotes from her books to kind of, attempt to point towards what she experienced. So this is from her book, Loving What Is. One morning, a week or so later, after checking into the halfway house, as she lay on the floor, she had been feeling too unworthy to sleep in a bed. Katie woke up without any concepts or who or what she was. There was no me, she says. All my rage, all the thoughts that had been troubling me, my whole world, the whole world, was gone. At the same time, laughter welled up from the depths and just poured out. Everything was unrecognizable. It was as if something else had awoken up. It opened its eyes. It was looking through Katie's eyes, and it was so delighted. It was intoxicated with joy. There was nothing separate, nothing unacceptable to it. Everything was its own very self. Now, let me find a quick quote here also from her latest book, A Mind at Home with Itself, that might bring this back to earth just a little bit. So let's see here. So she further says, She had no categories for what had happened, nor did anyone else around her. All she knew was that her life had changed utterly. A paranoid, agoraphobic, suicidal woman had instantaneously become joyful and serene, and had been given a method that could keep her rooted in that state without returning to the world of delusion. She claims that the questions of the work arose spontaneously during this particular experience. Now, here's the important thing. I discovered that when I believed my thoughts, I suffered. But that when I didn't believe them, I didn't suffer. and that this is true for every human being. Freedom is as simple as that. I found that suffering is optional. So this is quite profound. And one thing I've noticed in my own practice is that everyone has crazy thinking. Everyone has crazy thinking. But what seems to differentiate the people who suffer a lot from the people who suffer way less is that the people who suffer more have a tendency to believe their thoughts a lot more. They automatically believe them, buy into them, feel and live as if the thoughts are real. Whereas the people who suffer less often have an increased capacity to not necessarily identify with or so easily believe in the thoughts that arise. So here's another quote from Byron Katie. Generosity is what's left of you after you realize that there's no such thing as a self. We're going to get back to that one later as kind of a double-edged sword. There's also one more here that I want to share, which I found to be true in my own experience. The mind can never be controlled. It can only be questioned, loved, and met with understanding. If you really inquire into your experience, you'll realize that thoughts just appear on their own, and it's not that you let go of them, they let go of you once they're met with love, understanding, and acceptance. And this is also kind of profound. Now, when I do this review, I want you to keep something in mind, and that is that I have not had the depth of realization that Byron Katie has had. And that might influence this review. It might be that if I had had a deeper, more profound, more permanent realization, that at least some of this review might have looked different. So where I can meet Byron Katie is that I've had a lot of experiences over the years of waking up to a particular thought and waking up to various identities, self-concepts, and that has been profoundly liberating. There is something about Katie's experience that seems completely profound and outside of the range of what most of us have ever experienced. So when I look back here, I'm just going to find a quick thing here. Where was it? Yeah, here we go. This is the last thing. So she had no recollection of her former life, as she stepped into her family's story with a fearlessness that one can only be in awe of. Her husband and children suddenly appeared at the halfway house out of nowhere. This large stranger is my husband? These three people who I've never seen before are my children? Okay, the slate had been wiped clean. So she claims to really not even have a recollection of much of her former life. I've never had that sort of wiping everything clean, so to speak. I never had that. Although you gotta suspect if perhaps there might be a stroke involved. If you read books like My Stroke of Insight with the neuroscientist Jill Bolte Taylor, she and other people mention similar experiences that might be the result of a stroke as well. So anyways, let's get into the work. What I perceive to be the strengths and what I perceive to be the weaknesses of this particular way of working. So when you do the work, she does something quite brilliant. Most of us have a tendency to point our finger outwards and blame other people, the world, and events. So she paces that by creating something called Judge Your Neighbor Worksheet, where you get the chance to judge your neighbor and write down what he or she should do different, what you need from them, what you're never willing to experience from them again, how they piss you off, so on and so forth. And by writing your thoughts down and by projecting everything out, you get a chance to stabilize your thoughts, your stories, and to look at them. So writing is a big part of this. And there's 4 questions. The first question is just to look at the claims and to ask, is this true? Now, the work is not a philosophical discussion. It's a meditation where you take one concept at the time, you isolate it, you ask the question, and you wait for your heart, you wait for the answer to emerge. So quite simply, is it true? Gives us a chance to inquire into whether the thought is true or not. Now, people might say yes, maybe. If they do, there's a second question, and that question is, can you absolutely know that that's true? There is a brilliance to that question, because if you really honestly look at any concept and you ask the question, can I absolutely know that this is true? That tends to open up a space where we can inquire deeply into that particular belief. And very often we get the chance to land at a no, that we can't really know that that's true, even though it's looked that way for a long time. This gives us a glimpse. This gives us a relief. We might land at a I don't know. We might also land at a yes, right? But one thing I find really brilliant about this particular question, can you absolutely know that it's true, as a meditation, is that when you look into some of the science, the scientific research that has been done around beliefs, it shows that we humans have a tendency our brains tend to be belief engines, and we tend to engage in confirmation bias. We have a tendency to see what matches our beliefs and to discount and not even see what doesn't. And we seem to have very different criteria for things we believe in versus things we don't believe in. So to be able to maintain a belief, it looks as if we can kind of convince ourselves that, can I believe in this belief? We will usually continue to believe it. And when it comes to stuff that we don't want to accept, like, can I discount this? Can I find one weak point to this argument? If we can do that, we have a tendency to discount the whole thing. So this question of, can I absolutely know that it's true, and to really meditate and inquire into that, kind of gets us, it's a great way to get us beyond that automatic tendency to defend the belief because we kind of can believe in it. The third question is, how do I react when I believe this, with this belief? And then the final question is, who would I be without that belief? And this is also a very great way to, in a kind of cause and effect way, by contrast, get the chance to discover what is my experience when I believe this, and also what is my experience when I don't believe this. So these questions are really, really good. It gives us the chance to break the spell of identifying and automatically believing in our stressful thoughts. There's something else too that I think is great about Byron Katie's The Work, and that is she talks about 3 different businesses: my business, your business, and God or nature's business. So essentially, what I think, believe, feel, my business. What you think, value, believe, feel, your business. Whether it rains or not, nature's business. This particular tool of just having an awareness of these 3 different businesses and just being able to notice whose business am I in can be very useful in establishing healthy psychological boundaries. And as most of my clients discover when they really look at this, they very often realize that they spend much of their life in other people's business psychologically by being a dictator, by kind of psychologically stepping into other people's worlds and demanding that they see certain things, that they understand certain things, that they appreciate certain things, that they do certain things, all the while not being in their own business. So this is a very useful tool. Now, finally, as another stroke of genius in this particular method, we have the turnarounds. Most of the time, most of us tend to look at what's projected instead of looking at the projector. And the turnarounds give us the opportunity to glimpse, to have some experience of the opposite of what we have up until now been thinking and believing. It's a great tool for self-insight and to own our own projections, right? So let's say, so I'll give you an example of this. And this is from the book The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen Covey. And it's just an example I really like that illustrates how our projections, meaning how we see other people, dramatically influences how we behave, and it also influences how they behave around us. So changing our projections can offer us a richer experience. So let's see here. Yes, Stephen Covey and his wife had been getting increasingly worried about their child who was struggling academically and apparently came across as emotionally immature and socially awkward. His parents dutifully attempted to boost his self-esteem with a relentless diet of praise and encouragement, but nothing seemed to be working. In the end, it dawned on Covey that the real problem was their internal representation of their boy. So he explains, when we honestly examined our deepest feelings, we realized that our perception of him was that he was basically inadequate, somehow behind. No matter how much we worked on our attitude and behavior, our efforts were ineffective because despite our actions and our words, what we really communicated to him was, you aren't capable, you need to be protected. By challenging the inadequate image of their son they carried around with them, Covey and his wife gradually released him to become a confident, self-assured, and capable young man. So when you do the turnarounds in the work, you get a chance to look at your own projector. So let me give you an example from my life. I remember quite a few years ago, I had to deal with a bureaucrat, and my blood was boiling. And I thought, what a fucking idiot, right? That was my projection. And my demand of him was that he's got to be able to do some independent thinking. So I stopped, I wrote this down, I inquired, and I turned it around. So there's several ways of turning it around. The first one was, my thinking is fucking idiotic. So instead of he's a fucking idiot, it was my thinking is fucking idiotic. So I sat with that and I started looking for how my thinking was idiotic in that moment. I'm looking for examples of that. And it dawned on me that my thinking was idiotic in the sense of I was blaming him for being the source of my emotional state. That's kind of idiotic, right? I also looked at, well, what else here is idiotic? Well, I'm demanding that he has to do independent thinking when he clearly shows me that he does not have that inclination at all. So by demanding psychologically that this guy engage in independent thinking, while simultaneously him showing me clearly that he does not have that inclination, by believing in that demand, I felt a lot of stress and a lot of anger. That's another example of idiotic thinking. Uh, I turn it around. I should engage in independent thinking. And at first, that one didn't resonate because I thought, but I am engaging in independent thinking. But as I really meditated on it, I suddenly realized that, wait a minute, I'm being the mouthpiece here of a belief that says that this guy and people in general should be doing independent thinking. Can I differentiate myself or take a step back from that particular belief and challenge whether it's really true that this guy has to do independent thinking? Can I do some independent thinking separate from that particular belief? That was quite liberating. Another turnaround was he should not be engaging in independent thinking, quite simply because he's not, right? So in the same way that it shouldn't be sunshine out right now because it isn't. It should be raining because it's raining. So he should not be engaging in independent thinking because he's not. That seems to be the reality of it. That's another turnaround, right? Another turnaround was he's not a fucking idiot. And that one too was hard to find. That one too was hard to find. But it suddenly dawned on me that, wait a minute, this guy is perhaps playing the game and checking off the boxes in such a way that creates the least hassle for him and allows him to navigate that particular system as a bureaucrat. There's a particular, call it intelligence or lack of stupidity in that. So these turnarounds give you the opportunity to see stuff that you haven't seen before. So let's say that what I'm projecting is, for example, onto my wife, that she should listen to me, for example. So one particular turnaround is she shouldn't listen to me. Like, what's the reality? Is she listening to me right now? Well, she shouldn't, because she isn't at this particular time. That might be the reality of it. Another turnaround might be, I should listen to her. So at the moment where I'm demanding that she should listen to me, am I really displaying the qualities that I'm looking for my wife? Am I listening in that particular moment? Because if I'm not listening, I'm going to project naturally that she is not listening, right? So since I think it's so easy, perhaps I should live it. Another turnaround is I should listen to me. Like, if I really listen to me in this particular moment, what might I discover? Given that it really is my job to listen to me, not my wife's. Now, if you look at, this is interesting, if you look at someone like the serial killer, Ted Bundy, he was well known for telling his forensic psychiatrist, the forensic psychiatrists and psychologists who were interviewing him, that he was just an ordinary guy, that everyone was essentially like him and sadistic, and that some people just did a better job in covering it up or playing the game, which he didn't quite bother to do in the same way. This is an interesting example of, like, of course, that's what he's going to naturally project because that's where he operates. The psychology professor Abigail Marsh, who is a psychopathy researcher and who's also done a lot of research into people who perform acts of extreme altruism, when she talks to extreme altruists, people who have donated their kidneys to strangers, uh, which really fits the bill of what you could call extreme altruism. It's a voluntary, painful procedure to benefit someone else, and there's no praise, there's no money, there's nothing for you in it in that sense. When these people are interviewed and they're asked, what made you so good or what made you so special or different, the answer is virtually always that they're not particularly good or special or different. They have a tendency to tell her that if you study me and other people like me, you'll discover that we're just like you. There really is no difference. And this is also an example again of people projecting their own nature, and their own orientation onto onto the world and onto everyone else. Um, so looking at projections too can be extremely powerful because you get the chance to realize that for you, for example, all I can ever be for you is whoever you project me to be, whoever your thought process makes this Jürgen Rasmussen character out to be, whatever motives, characteristics, whatever you project onto me, that's who I am in your experience, no more, no less, and vice versa. You're going to be to me whoever my mind projects you to be. And realizing that and having some choice about that can be extremely liberating. So I worked with a 15-year-old girl who had experienced a lot of bullying in school and a lot of depressive thoughts, a lot of fear of not being approved, stuff like that. And I I did some experiments with her around this, and suddenly it dawned on her where she said, "Wait a minute, those other girls have a story of me being a particular way, and they think that I am that story, but that's not me." And that was profoundly liberating. By working on projections in this way, you get the chance to see that you are not made up by other people's stories. And other people are not made up by your stories. And if you inquire even more, you get to see that you are not made up by your story of who you are either. So there is some huge relief to be found in that. All right, so let's look at some of what I think are some weak spots here and some criticisms. We'll start with some pseudo criticisms, meaning some criticisms that people often use that I don't think quite hold up. So one critique that people often use is that Byron Katie is essentially practicing cognitive behavioral therapy without a license and is thereby not qualified. Let's be honest about this. If you look at systems like CBT or Albert Ellis's REBT, like Ellis has been extremely straight that there's virtually very little new to REBT and CBT that wasn't already there in Stoicism, Old Greek and Roman philosophers, and in Buddhist philosophy. So virtually everything that you see in CBT and REBT has been adopted by Old Greek, Roman philosophers, Stoicism, and some Buddhist philosophy. And now therapists are calling that therapy and claiming that only they can do it, and that their guild interest organizations have to certify the people who do it. This is kind of ludicrous, in my opinion. Also, this isn't really cognitive therapy, because what you often do in cognitive therapy is that well, first of all, there's often behavioral interventions, and there's often a lot of teaching in critical thinking skills and learning to reason better. RABT is quite philosophical. There's often an emphasis on disputing irrational beliefs and replacing them with more rational thoughts. That's not really the aim of the work. The work is strictly a meditation where you look at one concept at the time, ask the 4 questions, and practice the turnarounds. It doesn't really advocate anything. So it's quite different in that regard. Another critique that people sometimes come with is that it's a form of gaslighting, especially when you look at people who may have been raped, mugged, molested, and Byron Katie is using these turnarounds to really challenge their victim identity, and now I don't think this is a valid critique. I've never seen anything there that I would call gaslighting. Gaslighting is a term that's very common in the narcissism industry, used to kind of describe when someone else is deliberately trying to ruin someone else's reality, and might even be tricking them and duping them and deceiving them with bad intentions. Remember that people who do the work are there on a voluntary basis, and they're asking for assistance in relieving their own suffering. Your job is to help them to question their sacred beliefs about who they are, right? So a colleague of mine recently asked, well, if you turn around, for example, I was raped to I wasn't raped. How could that be true, for example? Well, if you really meditate on that, you can find that. Meaning, consciousness, being itself, the open space that everything appears in, just like a mirror, is not improved or diminished by any experience. Consciousness itself, your fundamental nature, so to speak, is not enhanced or diminished by any experience. Consciousness itself is already free of any experience that might have appeared in it. So this is an example of something you can find if you turn it around. Examples like, well, I raped me. Well, if you really inquire, you might discover that you volunteered for an act, for example, or that you didn't say no out of fear that you wouldn't be loved, or you wouldn't be appreciated, or something like that. Or you might discover, I've been raping me with my thinking. It's really the thinking process after the fact is creating a lot of the stress. So I'm not saying that you have to do these sorts of turnarounds, but there can often be some profound things to discover in doing that. So let's look at a couple of the criticisms. One criticism, and Byron Katie says the work doesn't really advocate anything, and that's true, but it's really easy to kind of misunderstand it. So when you ask, for example, is it true? Can I absolutely know that this is true? This is a great meditation to kind of undo your own suffering. But that doesn't mean that this is the tool to kind of approach everything in your life, for example. So let's say that you have a suspicion that the gymnastics coach might be molesting your teenage daughter, for example. Well, if you sit down and you ask, is it true? Well, it kind of looks like some evidence. Can I absolutely know that it's true? You kind of land on no, I can't really. Well, how do you react when you believe this? Well, I get stressed, I get anxious. Who would you be without that thought? Well, I'd be relaxed, I'd be fine. Okay, let's turn it around. He's not abusing my teenage daughter. Can I find evidence of that? I'm abusing my teenage daughter, meaning I'm playing the movies of her being abused in my mind. Like, in this particular case, the answer to whether it's true that she's being molested or not does not lie in doing the work on yourself. It lies in investigating what's actually going on, right? So the answers are out there. Also, the question in of itself, can you absolutely know that it's true? It's a nice question as a meditation to help people to see that their feeling state doesn't necessarily tell them anything about what's true, because whether something is true or not is often not about what you feel, it's about the actual evidence, right? So, or you could use this in self-serving ways. Let's say that you were a prosecutor and it started to come in evidence that showed that perhaps you had contributed to putting an innocent person behind bars. You might do the work on yourself and go, can I know that he's innocent? Well, can I absolutely know that he's innocent? You might land at a no, and you might, well, how do I feel when I believe this? I feel horrible. This is, how would what would who would I be without this thought? Well, I'd be calm. Well, he's guilty. You could turn around and just look for the evidence for that, and you might feel fine. So this would be an example of using the work in a context where that's not what's going to help you discover what's true about whether someone's actually guilty or not. And you might not be using it with the motive of ending your own suffering per se, or discovering what's true, but you might be using it as a way of evading reality, so to speak. The same can happen with projection games. So I had an NLP trainer once, / spiritual teacher, who was a pretty shady character, right? A pretty shady character. And this particular person, he would do things such as, if you went to richardbander.com or johngrinder.com at the time, you would end up at his particular website. And he was heavily teaching. He did a lot of things that I think were quite shady, ethically. But he was really emphasizing this perception is projection frame with his students, where the argument was that if you didn't see him as pure love and light, you had work to do, and he always had a new course to sell you, right? So what I noticed happening was that there was a lot of people walking around with shiny eyes saying, that's excellent, that's wonderful, that's fantastic, that's amazing, no matter what was happening. And I suspect that this was a kind of game they were playing, in terms of, if I only see love and light everywhere, that means that I'm just so completely evolved. But I remember when I brought to their attention some of the stuff that was going on, it would be like, because that would, seeing that seemed to challenge who they wanted to think of themselves as being. Now, I did confront this particular NLP / spiritual teacher. I also later did the work on myself and said, I'm kind of a shady character. And first of all, I was like, what? I'm not nicking people's websites or claiming credit for work I haven't done. But it dawned on me that, hey, I knew he had done that, and I still signed up for his course. I still chose to, with my wallet book, kind of endorse what he was doing by signing up. And I didn't see that about myself, see my own shady contribution in that until I did that. So the work does not say that you should stay in an abusive relationship or anything like that. But I've noticed with people, and people can easily do the work to kind of justify staying in these sorts of situations. I think another big trap with the work, there's this notion that no one's wiser than anyone else, no one's more ethical than anyone else, no one's more mature than anyone else. I don't think this claim holds up. So one weakness might be if you come across someone an individual who's very psychopathic, who has strong psychopathic tendencies or extremely strong malignant narcissistic tendencies. This notion that everyone is a mirror reflection of your own thinking, yeah, it is true ultimately, but people are also different. And if you sit down and you look for the psychopath and the narcissist, in yourself, you might find a lot of, stuff there that can be liberating, given that you're projecting it, so to speak. But you can easily dilute yourself into thinking that, well, as soon as I own that, I'll only see this other person as love and light. And you might set yourself up to be killed, hurt, through a somewhat naive approach to spirituality. So, and remember that thing that I said in the beginning, that when it's realized that there's no self, the only thing that's left is generosity. This idea that Byron Katie often talks about, that we are love, and God is great, God is good, and God is everywhere. She essentially means that we are God. We are that which everything kind of emerges out of. That there is one mind. So in that sense, you're only ever working with yourself. There's often a notion in spiritual communities and spiritual teachers that if only fear could go away, if only these stories could go away, we would be revealed as pure love and pure light. There is a naivety in this. If you look at both human and animal, how, like chimpanzees, for example, they're brutal, they're aggressive. They probably don't have these sorts of self-referential stories. Their nature is not just love and light, right? Back to Abigail Marsh, the psychopathy researcher. She talks about how psychopaths, people who are truly psychopathic, tend to be virtually fearless. Like they don't really have much of a fear response. And you can see that their amygdalas are actually smaller than non-psychopaths. That their amygdalas are way less reactive to fearful facial expressions and other people's fear-based suffering. And that they're also way less good at spotting fearful facial expressions in other people, because they can't project it, right? Because they don't really have that fear response themselves. Psychopaths also, the really psychopathic ones, don't really have a sense of self in the way that most people conventionally do. But all that's left of these folks is not love and generosity. They're social predators. And again, back to Abigail Marsh, I highly recommend her book, The Fear Factor, When she looks at extreme altruists, the people who have donated their kidneys, or one kidney to strangers, and people who have done heroic self-sacrificing acts, these people have different brains than the psychopaths. Their amygdalas are bigger, not only than the psychopaths, but compared to what you call non-psychopathic regular people. Their amygdalas are way more sensitive to fearful facial expressions in other people. And they are better at recognizing fear in the faces, in the facial expressions of other people. And when these people are asked, are you fearless? They usually say the opposite. They say, no, I was terrified. I was really afraid. They usually describe themselves as people who are prone to fear, more sensitive to fear, and quite often no strangers to anxiety. And these people who often are more fearful and have more anxiety are often the heroes, because there's a difference between being courageous and being fearless. These people are often the heroes when push comes to shove, and the most generous in terms of performing extreme altruistic acts. Whereas the people who are fearless and don't really have a sense of self are anything but. So, of course, there might be a difference, though, in being fearless as a result of insight into the nature of thought versus being fearless due to having, for example, a deficient amygdala. There are people with specific diseases that destroy the amygdala and who literally don't feel any fear. These people are not more generous or more altruistic or wiser or more loving or anything like that. So I think some of these claims that Byron Katie and other spiritual teachers are offering might be a time to revisit some of them. She has quite a few who so for example she'll say defense is the first act of war, and of course psychologically that's kind of true, that as soon as you kind of defend yourself against something, that's your first act of war. But if you extend it to society, would you really want to live in a society that doesn't really make a good distinction between a mugging and self-defense, for example? What kind of society would that be? So a lot of the ideas that she pushes, I think are worth challenging. And something else too, one thing that she does is that she seems to jump and alternate between two positions. So one position is one of really clear boundaries. My business, your business, nature's business. I'm projecting this onto you. That's one perspective. But another perspective is the perspective of being nothing and everything, that there really is no such thing as a self that's separate from the experience. So from that point of view, you are the nothingness or the no thingness that everything emerges out of. You are the character you take to be you. You are the other person. You are the total environment. So from that perspective, it makes a lot of sense to say that the only thing you're ever working with is yourself, because it's all you and there is no you simultaneously. And the fact that she doesn't specify which of these positions she's working from, especially when she's working with people who have no clue as to the second perceptual position here, a lot of the turnarounds can seem like gaslighting or blaming a victim and stuff like that. And sometimes it can even seem a bit like, if you ever studied cold reading. I went to a seminar many years ago with a cold reader, and he had this system so that no matter what you said, you were right. So let's say you said to the other person, "Oh, you're thinking about a female," and the other person says, "No, it's actually a male." Well, you could say, "Well, I didn't mean the biological sense. I meant that the person has many of the qualities that we associate with the feminine." So you're just changing the criteria. Or this person reminds you of the need to cultivate the feminine in yourself. Or this person, despite being a man, is very much in touch with the feminine. Or you are inspiring that person to get in touch with the feminine. Like if you change the criteria enough, you can end up being right, about just about everything. And sometimes the turnarounds can begin to sound like that. So for example, an example in her first book is a woman who says, my husband should exercise more, or no, my husband should get in shape. And Byron Katie turns it around to this woman, I should get more in shape. And she says, me, but I am in shape. Oh, well, how about mentally? Or my husband shouldn't be smoking. Well, I shouldn't be smoking. Well, I don't smoke. Well, mentally, how much of the time are you in his business running the smoking videotape, feeling the stress in your body, right? So it's kind of cheating in a sense because you're changing the criteria, but it can still be useful in the service of gaining more perspectives. I'll share a final thing with you here, which people often the critics often use as an example of going to crazy town. So she makes this claim, and this is from a book called Losing the Moon, her first book. Can you know that Hitler didn't bring more people to realization than Jesus? God is everything. God is sacred. Everything is sacred. So how could there ever be any evil? She talks about it takes an absolute love of God. Is it I love God, or is it I love God sometimes when he's giving me the reality I want? War is what is. It is nature. It's what is sometimes. It's not personal. If someone, and she talks about the Nazi concentration camps, if someone, God, what is, pulls my baby from me, if that's what it takes, I'm there. Take the baby, tear my baby from me, throw it in the fire. What does it take for me to get this thing? What does it take for me to understand that I am a lover of what is? My discomfort is my war with God. It's my war with reality the way it is, and not the loss of my baby. It's not as though I have a choice. The baby is me. You see, there are no choices. What is. When you know that, it's over, and it's beyond full acceptance. It's the love of itself, the love of God. There is nothing terrible. There has never been anything terrible. But when we get to the baby thing, we're getting down to our sacred little concepts now. You take my baby from me. You're messing with the illusion of I'm the mommy. This is the baby. There's the daddy. We're going to raise it happy ever after in the future fairy tale. Now, this sounds crazy. And I also struggle to find that much wisdom in it. Now, if you look at it from a my business, your business, realities business perspective, this just seems completely crazy. But if you look at it from the perspective of there being no such thing as a self, that you are the no thingness that everything emerges out of, then you simultaneously are the baby and the Nazi soldier and the mommy and everything. It all arises as one thing. In that sense, you're only ever working with yourself. And there's the realization that since there is no self, there is no free will, there is no self that could choose differently, right? But still, I think the claim that God is good and God is everything, if you use the term conventionally, the way most people do, as God as a larger force outside of us, I think a God that allows the Holocaust is either completely impotent to act or completely psychopathic if he doesn't intervene. That's not a loving God. If you take the perspective that we are God, in the sense that we are the no thingness that it all emerges from, consciousness itself, and we are all the creations, it's all one thing. If you take that perspective, I would still argue that there's no thingness that we fundamentally are, still is a pretty confused being or process that's evolving. So I don't quite see how you land on the good, God is good and God is everything. But there you go. Anyways, I hope this in-depth analysis was useful. I highly recommend her books, especially the first one, the second one, Loving What Is, and the last one, A Mind at Home with Itself. I would recommend getting those two. I highly recommend playing with the work on yourself. There's a lot there to be discovered. Um, I don't know Byron Katie personally. Um, I've seen her once at an event in Oslo that I attended. There is a woman called Janaki who used to be a employee of Byron Katie for 12 years, who has written a PDF you can find on the internet. It's not too complimentary of Byron Katie. Um, I don't know to what extent it's a hit piece, or to what extent there might be some reality to it. But if you're really going to go down that rabbit hole, you might as well look at it. So anyways, I'd be very curious to hear your comments, to what extent you agree, disagree, whatever takes you have on this video. Please do comment and share it. As always, if you're looking for change work, mentoring, you can reach me at provocativehypnosis.com. Thanks for listening.